September 1945. Morning light slanted across the barbed fences of a U.S. prisoner of war camp in the Philippines. The war had ended weeks earlier, but silence still ruled the compound. A group of Japanese women, once nurses and clerks in the Imperial Army, stood in a wooden mess hall that smelled faintly of soap and coffee. Their eyes fixed on a tray set before them, metal plates, warm bread, and a small square of pale yellow butter melting slowly on top. For years, they had lived on bitter rice paste and the thin chemical taste of wartime margarine, told that real butter belonged only to decadent Westerners. Yet here it was, offered freely by the very enemy they had been taught to fear. One woman hesitated, then spread it carefully, watching it dissolve into the crust. The first bite was soft, foreign, almost unreal. Tears came without warning, not from hunger now, but from memory. That single taste carried them back to a Japan that no longer existed. Before the war, butter had been a rare luxury in Japan, a Western indulgence found only in foreign hotels and upper-class homes. Ordinary families cooked with sesame oil or rendered fat. When Japan's militarists pushed the nation toward self-sufficiency in the late 1930s, imported dairy products vanished from shelves almost overnight. The government declared foreign butter a wasteful pleasure, unfit for a nation at war. Housewives were told to replace it with margarine produced from vegetable oil and whale fat. Propaganda posters showed smiling women spreading the pale substitute on rice bread, proof of patriotic sacrifice. By 1943, even margarine had become a memory. The empire's trade routes collapsed under Allied blockade. The Home Ministry rationed food in grams. Soldiers on distant islands received a spoonful of soybean paste for breakfast, while civilians queued for hours for a handful of rice mixed with barley. Husks. Malnutrition darkened the skin of children in Tokyo and Osaka. Scurvy appeared among sailors of the Imperial Navy. In those years, taste itself became political. Sweetness, fat, and fullness were indulgences of the enemy. When Japan's surrender finally came in August 1945, the collapse was total. Factories burned, railways halted, warehouses stood empty. In the ruins, hundreds of Japanese women who had served near the front lines were captured or surrendered to advancing American forces. Many were clerks, translators, or nurses attached to medical units in the Philippines and the Marianas. They had been told that capture meant dishonor, torture, or death. Some carried cyanide tablets hidden in their uniforms. Yet when American trucks arrived, the soldiers offered not bullets but canteens of water and field rations wrapped in wax paper. The first hours of captivity were filled with confusion and disbelief. The women expected interrogation, humiliation, perhaps even public execution. Instead, U.S. Army medics examined their health, recorded their names, and distributed clean clothing. Under Geneva Convention policy, all prisoners, male or female, enemy or ally, were to receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care. The rules were not always perfect, but compared with the starvation they had known, the conditions felt unreal. At night, inside the temporary camps built from Quonset huts and bamboo, the women lay awake listening to the steady hum of American generators. They smelled soap for the first time in years, real soap with a scent of lavender oil. They saw electric lights, canned milk, and boxes stamped U.S. Army butter. The words looked strange, almost holy in their simplicity. Butter, that symbol of everything Japan had been taught to reject, now traveled freely among soldiers who had crossed an ocean to defeat them. Each morning, the mess hall opened with the sound of metal trays sliding across wooden tables. The food was plain by American standards: oatmeal, boiled eggs, coffee, and bread. But to the prisoners, every bite was overwhelming. Many could not finish their portions, afraid of appearing greedy. Some wept quietly, ashamed to show emotion in front of guards. For them, food had always been rationed by obedience. Now it was given without condition. The transformation was slow. Fear did not vanish in a single day. Rumors still spread among the captives that the butter might be poisoned, that kindness was a test. Yet nothing happened. The Americans treated them with the same distant politeness shown to their own. Hunger, suspicion, and ideology began to loosen their hold. Behind the fences, under the tropical sun, the war's propaganda dissolved with each meal. The women who had believed Americans were monsters found them chatting over cigarettes, sharing extra sugar packets, even learning fragments of Japanese phrases to make conversation easier. The prisoners, in turn, began to taste again, and not just the butter or coffee, but the lost sensation of being human. That was the first quiet miracle of captivity, to discover compassion in the camp of one's enemy. And it was only the beginning of what the women would soon learn about the strange abundance of their former foes. The Women in those camps had grown up in an empire that preached purity through hunger. During the war years, Japanese schools taught children to see restraint as moral virtue. Teachers reminded students that every grain of rice saved was a bullet for a soldier. Food was duty, not pleasure. Even the idea of savoring a meal carried suspicion of weakness. Housewives stretched meager rations with roots, bean husks, and sawdust flour. When margarine appeared in stores, it was hailed as modern and efficient, a symbol of industrial progress under the emperor's banner. But its taste was dull, metallic, leaving a residue that never quite melted. Over time, the difference between butter and margarine became more than culinary. It became ideological. One belonged to the decadent West, the other to Japan's austere spirit. When defeat arrived, this belief system shattered as suddenly as the empire itself. Japan's surrender did not merely mark the end of combat, it marked the collapse of an entire moral order. For those taken prisoner, especially women, captivity felt like exile from everything they had been taught to value: loyalty, honor, sacrifice. To accept food from the enemy was to acknowledge dependence, a humiliation more painful than hunger itself. Many hesitated even to touch the meals given by American guards, leaving portions untouched as a silent act of pride. Yet the Americans persisted, methodically and without malice. U.S. Army supply chains were vast and efficient, built to feed millions of men across multiple theaters of war. Dairy products came in tins or powdered form, shipped from Wisconsin or California in staggering quantities. The military's quartermaster corps followed strict nutrition charts. 3 is 600 calories per soldier per day, including fats, proteins, and vitamins. The same rations extended to prisoners under Geneva rules. Each camp had a kitchen staffed by enlisted cooks, Red Cross inspectors, and sometimes even former prisoners trained to assist. Nothing about this was sentimental. It was bureaucracy, but it was humane bureaucracy. Inside those mess halls, cultural distances began to narrow. The women watched the cooks unwrap cans labeled butter, pasteurized, grade A. They saw the creamy color, the faint salt shimmer, the simple abundance that wartime Japan had erased. Some whispered to each other in disbelief, "America no tabemono wa nande kona ni yawarakai." Why is American food so soft? It was a question about texture, but also about power. Softness meant excess, safety, peace, things Japan had forgotten. Days passed, then weeks. Routines formed. The guards no longer seemed like conquerors, and the prisoners no longer behaved like shadows. They cleaned the dining hall, swept floors, and folded blankets in the morning heat. The butter remained, a small luxury repeated at every breakfast. At first, many women avoided it out of habit or suspicion, preferring plain bread or coffee. But hunger and curiosity eventually overcame pride. One by one, they began to spread the golden smear across toast, watching it soak in like light returning to a photograph. Those who had once worked in hospitals or schools recognized the flavor instantly. Butter had been part of Japan's pre-war memory, a faint echo of a world connected to Europe, to trade, to openness. Tasting it again felt like returning to a forgotten time before militarism replaced curiosity with obedience. Some prisoners kept a small piece hidden on the edge of their plate, unwilling to let it disappear too fast. The Americans didn't understand what the butter meant to them. To the cooks, it was merely breakfast. But to the women, it was an unintentional act of reconciliation, nourishment offered without ideology. Within that gesture lay something powerful, proof that mercy could exist without victory parades, that decency did not need translation. Outside the wire, the world was changing faster than anyone could grasp. Japan lay in ashes. In Tokyo, families survived on black market rice, while occupation forces dined on imported food. The contrast was almost unbearable. Yet inside that distant camp, far from both home and battlefield, a quiet transformation was underway. The women were beginning to unlearn fear and to remember that kindness could taste like butter melting on bread. For historians, what happened inside those camps was more than an episode of captivity. It was a rare intersection of two moral systems colliding over something as ordinary as breakfast. To understand it, one must look from several angles: human, culinary, psychological, each revealing how war distorts even the simplest acts of eating. The human angle begins with the body itself. By 1945, malnutrition had shaped the Japanese population into silhouettes of endurance. Women in their 20s weighed little more than schoolchildren. Years of rationing had stripped away muscle, leaving fragile joints and pale skin, Hunger had become invisible routine, an ache so constant it no longer registered as suffering. In that condition, the human sense of taste withers too. Many of the women couldn't recall what true fat or sweetness felt like on the tongue. Their first contact with American butter wasn't simply pleasure, it was shock. The flavor triggered a physical reaction. Salivation, tears, laughter, shame, sensations that war had trained them to suppress. To eat openly in front of others required courage. Japanese wartime culture valued modesty in consumption. Meals were quick, silent, almost ceremonial. Food was shared in tiny equal portions, reflecting social harmony over appetite. But inside the American camps, eating was loud. Forks scraped trays, soldiers laughed, conversation filled the air. For the prisoners, this was alien, the noise of abundance. The act of chewing beside Americans felt at first like trespassing. Yet slowly, hunger's fear gave way to curiosity. For the first time in years, they began to eat until full. That fullness brought not guilt but warmth. The culinary angle revission. Eels another dimension, logistics and ideology. To the American military, food was strategy. Throughout the war, U.S. supply officers had understood that morale was built not only with weapons, but with calories. Butter, chocolate, and coffee were seen as vital for soldiers' strength and mental stability. Feeding prisoners under similar conditions was not mere charity, it was discipline, proof that democracy could maintain order even in victory. Each camp operated under meticulous guidelines: food storage, temperature, hygiene, portion control, inspection by the International Red Cross. Letters between supply officers described butter shipments from California creameries to Manila and Guam, repackaged in tins resistant to tropical heat. That efficiency carried symbolic weight. The butter tasted of industry, smooth, measured, predictable, the exact opposite of wartime Japan's chaos. Every spread on toast was a small reminder that America's power lay not only in bombs or ships, but in systems that delivered comfort across oceans. The prisoners did not articulate it in those terms, but they felt it. Civilization, they realized, could be organized around care rather than coercion. Then came the psychological angle, the unlearning of fear. From their earliest training, these women had been told that Americans were brutal, predatory, without honor. Military handbooks distributed to Japanese nurses warned that capture meant violation and death. To prevent it, they were issued cyanide or grenades, encouraged to die pure. The war's final months had reinforced this terror. Propaganda broadcasts claimed that American soldiers mutilated captives and mocked the dead. When surrender came, belief in that horror was absolute. But each day inside the camp dismantled the myth piece by piece. The guards were young, weary, indifferent. They treated the prisoners with formality, sometimes even embarrassment. There was no spectacle of cruelty, no vengeance. Instead, there was order, daily roll call, rations, sanitation checks. When a sick woman fainted from heat, an American medic carried her to the infirmary without hesitation. Such acts confused the captives more than any lecture could. Kindness contradicted everything they had been taught. And so, food became the first language of trust. Butter, in particular, embodied it perfectly. It melted easily, required no explanation, asked for nothing in return. It carried warmth and softness into a world that had known only discipline and deprivation. Each morning, the simple act repeated. A gesture of feeding, receiving, understanding. Slowly, suspicion faded. By the third week, some women began to smile at their guards. A few even tried to imitate their English. Thank you. Good morning. Laughter appeared in small moments, when someone dropped a tray, when a guard mispronounced a Japanese word. In those fragments of humanity, the war's machinery seemed to dissolve. The butter had done what no political document could. It humanized both sides. Historians later noted that these changes did not come from ideologue, but from contact. American policy during occupation emphasized re-education through behavior, not speeches. By treating prisoners humanely, they aimed to demonstrate the values of democracy through routine acts: cleanliness, fairness, nourishment. It worked quietly. The women who arrived expecting death left the camps remembering small details: the taste of buttered bread, the smell of coffee, the sound of laughter in the mess hall. Those memories would follow them long after repatriation. But within the camp itself, they formed something close to peace, fragile, temporary, but real. The women began to volunteer for tasks, to help prepare food for others, to contribute rather than merely receive. Hunger had been replaced by participation. It was not freedom yet, but it was dignity restored through flavor, texture, and care. And so, through something as simple as breakfast, enemies began to remember their shared humanity, one spoon of butter at a time. The transformation inside the camp could not be measured only in nutrition charts or calories gained. It unfolded in gestures, silences, and the slow rebuilding of self-worth. The Japanese women who once stood rigid during roll call began to rediscover the smallest freedoms, to laugh, to speak without permission, to taste without fear. In the beginning, every smile felt dangerous, but war's logic weakens quickly when confronted with the ordinary warmth of a meal. The psychological angle deepened over time. Many prisoners later described how the butter unsettled them more than any interrogation. It carried a strange tenderness they did not know how to process. Some felt guilty, as if enjoying the enemy's food betrayed their fallen comrades. Others felt grief, a sudden awareness of what had been lost, of the humanity that could have existed if not for propaganda and pride. Eating became confession. Each mouthful forced them to reconcile memory with reality. The butter was not simply nourishment, it was proof that everything they had believed about their enemies and themselves might have been wrong. Among the Americans, too, subtle changes occurred. The guards, most barely out of high school, had expected hostility. They found instead exhausted women, quiet and polite, who bowed when handed food. For many soldiers, the experience blurred the black and white lines of wartime morality. The enemy no longer looked like a poster caricature. She looked like someone's sister or classmate. A few guards wrote home about it, letters describing those Japanese girls who cried over breakfast. In those moments, compassion ceased to be theoretical. It became visible, shared between hands passing plates across a wooden counter. There was also the moral angle, the contrast between vengeance and restraint. The Pacific War had been fought with extraordinary brutality. From Nanking to Okinawa, mercy had been rare. Yet inside the American camps after 1945, policy dictated a higher standard. Prisoners were to be treated humanely, regardless of past atrocities. This rule was not born from naivete, but from calculation, an understanding that post-war peace would depend on moral credibility. By feeding their captives well, Americans were not just keeping records clean. They were demonstrating that civilization could survive victory. The butter became an ethical symbol, soft, golden, and incorruptible, a quiet answer to years of cruelty. The symbolic angle carried even further. For the Japanese women, butter's texture evoked memories buried under war. It reminded them of pre-war bakeries in Yokohama, of Western cafes where jazz played before the bands, of childhood stories about France and modernity. Those associations had been erased by censorship and nationalism. Now, in an American camp surrounded by barbed wire, they returned unexpectedly, carried by scent and taste. In that sense, the butter was not American at all. It was cosmopolitan, a reminder of the world that had once been open to Japan before militarism closed its doors. Some prisoners began to sketch, writing notes about food, ingredients, and recipes they had forgotten. A few even asked camp cooks how to make bread or whipped cream from powdered milk. These were small acts of intellectual hunger, the reawakening of curiosity after years of obedience. The camp's kitchen, once a site of humiliation, became a classroom of sorts. Through butter, the women reconnected with their own pre-war identities, educated, skilled, eager to learn. The cultural angle was no less profound. Japanese society had long equated discipline with virtue and indulgence with weakness. Wartime propaganda turned that belief into absolute law. But inside the camp, the women encountered another philosophy, that generosity could be strength, that compassion could coexist with power. The Americans did not hide their abundance. They shared it casually without boasting. This quiet confidence left a deep impression. In later interviews, several former prisoners said they realized then that true victory is not in killing, but in feeding. That single realization would echo through Japan's post-war reconstruction, shaping attitudes toward democracy, welfare, and human rights. The historical angle ties these human stories to the broader canvas of post-war change. When General Douglas MacArthur's occupation forces later restructured Japan's government and economy, they relied on similar ideas: nourishment before ideology, stability before reform. School lunches, milk programs, and bread rations became tools of peace. Historians now trace those policies back to the same philosophy visible in POW camps, the conviction that rebuilding begins with feeding. The butter served to those women was a preview of that transformation, a foreshadowing of Japan's recovery through care rather than control. Inside the camp, however, such meaning was not yet visible. To the prisoners, life still moved one day at a time. The tropical rains came, soaking laundry lines and softening the ground. The smell of diesel mixed with wet grass. Butter shipments sometimes ran late, and when the supply trucks finally arrived, the women would stand quietly, peaky, pretending not to notice their own relief. The butter was no longer novelty. It was comfort, something constant in a world of uncertainty. One morning, a guard offered an extra slice of toast to a nurse who had lost her family in Tokyo's firebombing. She bowed deeply before accepting. The guard shrugged, embarrassed, muttering, "Plenty more where that came from." She stared at the bread for a long time before eating. In that simple exchange lay everything the war had destroyed and what humanity was trying to rebuild: respect, humility, the fragile rhythm of normal life. By the time repatriation orders came months later, the women had grown accustomed to the camp's strange kindness. When they boarded the transport ships bound for Japan, many carried small notebooks, hand-drawn recipes, or a single wrapped piece of butter saved from breakfast. It was not sentimentality, it was remembrance, proof that even in defeat, dignity could survive through decency. And thus, long before treaties were signed or flags lowered, reconciliation had already begun. In a mess hall, over melted butter, between those who had once been taught to hate each other. It happened on a humid morning near the end of October 1945. The war was over, but in the camp the season still followed military order. Breakfast began at 0700 hours, as always. The mess hall was filled with the rustle of uniforms, the metallic clatter of trays, and the low murmur of American voices. On that day, however, something small broke the monotony. A shipment had arrived from the mainland, delayed for weeks by storms. Inside the wooden crates were tin-stamped Grade A cream butter, U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. The cooks, young GIs from Ohio and Kansas, opened the tins and passed the blocks to the kitchen table. The smell was unmistakable, rich, sweet, faintly salty. One of the sergeants joked that it was better than gold out here. To the Americans, it was just another ration delivery. To the Japanese prisoners who lined up outside, it was something else entirely. An echo of the life they had lost before the Empire's hunger swallowed everything. The women entered in silence. The guards directed them to their tables as usual. There was no speech, no ceremony. Each received a tray, 2 slices of bread, 1 boiled egg, a spoonful of jam, and beside it a neat portion of butter, pale as ivory. The warmth of the room began to soften it immediately, leaving faint streaks on the metal plate. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then, one of the older nurses, her hair still neatly tied despite the humidity, reached for her knife and spread it gently across the bread. Others followed. The first taste was almost unbearable. After years of deprivation, the sensation of real fat, real cream, felt overwhelming. The butter coated the tongue with a softness that no wartime margarine had ever mimicked. It wasn't just flavor, it was texture, memory, relief. For a few of them, it was the first truly satisfying bite they had taken since the war began, and with it came to arse, quiet, involuntary, unstoppable. The guards noticed but said nothing. They had seen hunger before, they had not seen this kind of silence. The women ate slowly, reverently, as if afraid the butter would vanish if they hurried. The air filled with the faint scent of toasted bread and melted fat, an aroma of peace so ordinary that it seemed miraculous. Some women covered their faces, hiding emotion behind their hands. Others looked down at their plates, unable to meet anyone's eyes. One American cook, wiping his hands on a towel, hesitated near the serving counter. He whispered to another, "They're crying." The second man shrugged. Guess they just missed the real thing. Neither spoke again. They turned back to their work, unaware that this small act, the simple serving of breakfast, had reached deeper into their prisoners' souls than any lecture on democracy could. In that moment, something irreversible shifted. The women realized that kindness required no explanation, no agenda. The butter was not charity, it was normalcy. It symbolized a world where food was meant to be shared, not weaponized. A few of the younger prisoners began to laugh softly through their tears. The sound spread hesitantly, like the first light after a long storm. Later that day, several of them gathered by the fence, exchanging stories. One nurse spoke about her childhood in Yokohama when her father once brought home a small tin of imported butter before the war. "It smelled just like this," she whispered. Another recalled baking with her mother before rationing began. "It was so long ago I thought I dreamed it." In those recollections, the war's narrative of hate crumbled piece by piece. They began to remember that life had once been about more than endurance. For the camp's American officers, the meal was routine, another entry in the logbooks. But for the prisoners, it marked a quiet turning point. The first morning when the taste of food felt like peace, not survival. The butter melted, the bread cooled, and the moment passed without fanfare. Yet in that simplicity lay the story of an empire's end and humanity's fragile recovery. That day, the women did not know that similar scenes were unfolding across other Pacific camps. In Guam, in Okinawa, in Saipan, where Japanese prisoners of all ranks experienced the same disorienting kindness. The Allied policy of humane treatment, guided by the Geneva Convention and MacArthur's directives, had become the quiet architect of post-war reconciliation. The butter, though never mentioned in any report, had done its work. As dusk fell over the camp, the women folded their blankets, swept the floor, and sat outside in the cooling air. The sky turned violet over the barbed wire. Someone began humming a tune, an old lullaby, almost forgotten. It drifted across the compound, mixing with the faint hum of American generators. No one silenced her. For the first time, music was allowed. For the first time, the sound of peace no longer felt foreign. The next morning, the same scene repeated. Bread, butter, silence. But this time, the silence carried something different. It was no longer the stunned quiet of disbelief. It was reflection. The women had begun to speak softly among themselves, comparing memories of home, of recipes once cooked in small kitchens before air raids erased everything familiar. A few even smiled when the guards passed by. The fear that had once filled every movement was dissolving, replaced by the slow return of dignity. Behind that transformation stood an American officer named Captain William Hargrave. He was in his late 30s, a former teacher from Illinois before the war, now assigned to oversee prisoner welfare. To him, the act of feeding was more than a regulation. It was a moral duty. He kept meticulous records, daily calorie counts, medical notes, food deliveries. His reports described the women as disciplined, courteous, undernourished, but cooperative. He had seen starvation up close during the liberation of other camps and believed that restoration began not with lectures, but with nourishment. "You cannot teach democracy to the starving," he once told a visiting chaplain. "Feed them first, then they'll listen." Hargrave had insisted that the women receive the same rations as American personnel, including butter. His superiors questioned the expense, but he persisted. He argued that food was diplomacy, that small acts of decency could reshape how a defeated nation saw its conqueror. His policy was not born from sentimentality, but from conviction that the war's moral victory would mean nothing if compassion did not follow. The women never knew his name, but they felt his principles in every meal. The kitchen crew followed his instructions precisely. No favoritism, no scolding, no humiliation. Each prisoner was addressed by number, but with civility. Over time, the lines between captor and captive blurred in the rhythm of daily life. Respect became habit. Letters from other camps echoed this pattern. Reports from Guam and Okinawa described similar moments. Japanese prisoners stunned by the abundance of American food, then moved to tears by gestures of ordinary kindness. Some accounts mention women writing messages of gratitude in broken English. "Thank you for giving us human life again." Such words never appeared in newspapers or official statements. They were private miracles, scattered like seeds across the Pacific. Within the camp in the Philippines, those small acts began to accumulate meaning. The butter became a symbol, and the mess hall, a stage where reconciliation quietly rehearsed itself. The Americans did not preach forgiveness. They demonstrated it through routine. They treated the women not as enemies to be punished, but as human beings to be restored. That discipline of decency had an effect stronger than propaganda. One afternoon, after weeks of fair weather, the camp held a short ceremony to mark the repatriation of the first group of prisoners. The women were assembled near the flagpole, their belongings neatly packed. The American officers stood opposite them, caps off. There were no speeches, only a brief exchange of salutes, awkward but sincere. As the trucks started their engines, one of the younger nurses stepped forward, holding something wrapped in paper. She handed it to a guard through the fence. Inside was a small piece of bread spread with the last of her butter ration. He accepted it without words, understanding instinctively what it meant. It was not a gift of food. It was acknowledgement, an offering of mutual respect. That moment passed without witnesses, yet it captured everything the war had failed to destroy: empathy, gratitude, and the simple desire to connect. As night fell, Captain Hargrave walked along the perimeter, noting the quiet. The camp was orderly, calm. Somewhere in the distance, a woman's voice hummed a familiar melody again. The same one heard weeks earlier after that first breakfast. It drifted softly through the warm air, fragile and haunting. Hargrave stopped, listening. The sound was neither triumphant nor sorrowful. It was human, plain, unguarded. He later wrote in his logbook, "They sang tonight. That is a good sign." In that entry lay the quiet climax of an entire war's emotional aftermath, the point at which hatred gave way to recognition. No treaty could capture it, no headline would record it. Yet history often turns on such invisible pivots: a meal shared, a song sung, a moment of compassion stronger than command. By the time the last prisoners departed for Japan, the mess hall stood empty, its tables wiped clean. The butter tins were nearly finished, their labels fading under tropical humidity. But the memory remained, the morning when former enemies sat together, not in battle, but in the ordinary peace of breakfast. For those women, the taste would never leave them. Long after they returned home through the years of rebuilding, they would remember the scent of that butter melting on warm bread, the sound of rain on the tin roof, and the realization that kindness could exist even after catastrophe. It became, for many, the most enduring flavor of the war, the taste of being human again. The ships that carried the women home reached Japan in the winter of 1946. The sea was calm, the air brittle with cold. From the deck, the returning prisoners saw their country for the first time in months. A coastline of gray ruins, skeletal piers, and broken harbors. Smoke rose from scattered settlements where survivors had built shacks from debris. Tokyo lay silent beneath its ash-colored sky, a capital of ghosts. For those who stepped ashore, victory and defeat had both lost meaning. What remained was hunger. They arrived thinner than when they had left, but healthier than most civilians. U.S. medical officers had documented their recovery. Average weight gained, improved skin tone, restored appetite. Yet the real change was invisible. These women carried with them a private knowledge the rest of Japan could not yet imagine, that their former enemies had shown mercy. Inside the ruins, that truth was difficult to explain. Many kept silent. At repatriation centers, officials took statements and photographs. The women were processed, questioned, and released into a nation that barely recognized itself. Some were shunned quietly. Captivity was still a mark of shame. Others were met with relief by families who had long assumed them dead. But when conversation turned to their treatment in American camps, hesitation filled the air. How could they describe being fed butter, fruit, milk, and meat while the homeland starved? How could they speak of kindness from the very people their nation had sworn to annihilate? In small villages where rice gruel replaced breakfast and roofs leaked through burned rafters, such stories sounded impossible. The women quickly learned to change details, to speak vaguely of fair conditions, of ordinary meals. The full truth, the warmth of the food, the compassion of the guards, seemed indecent beside the cold suffering around them. Yet inside, they knew what they had witnessed. Historians later found fragments of their testimonies in post-war archives. One nurse wrote that the Americans fed us not as captives but as people. Another, in a diary smuggled home, described her first taste of butter as the moment I felt Japan had lied to me. Such admissions were radical in the Japan of 1946, where propaganda still lingered like dust in the ruins. The government's censorship bureau, still operating under Allied supervision, discouraged discussion of imperial failures. Publicly, the nation mourned its soldiers. Privately, it tried to forget the ideology that had demanded their deaths. But memory does not obey politics. For these women, the contrast between wartime hunger and post-war compassion remained vivid. When U.S. occupation authorities introduced school lunches for Japanese children, bread, milk, butter, and jam, many of those former prisoners recognized the taste immediately. They understood that the same policy which had sustained them was now being extended to an entire nation. Butter again became a quiet symbol. This time, not of surrender, but of survival. By 1947, American food aid flooded Japan. Powdered milk, wheat, and canned fats became the building blocks of reconstruction. Yet for those who had eaten real butter in captivity, no substitute could match its meaning. It was the flavor of contradiction, the enemy's gift that restored their health, the product of a system they had been taught to despise but now associated with life itself. Some of the women found work in hospitals or schools, contributing to Japan's recovery. Others retreated into anonymity, their experiences untold for decades. But within their silence lived a form of understanding few others possessed, that the boundary between enemy and human being can dissolve faster than anyone expects, sometimes in the time it takes for butter to melt on warm bread. In the years that followed, Japan changed faster than memory could keep pace. Cities rebuilt, factories reopened, and the country that had once glorified sacrifice began to rediscover comfort. Yet within that new prosperity lived a generation of silent witnesses who carried a different story, not of battle but of breakfast. The former prisoners of war rarely spoke publicly about what they had experienced. In a society that equated endurance with virtue, admitting gratitude toward the occupier felt like betrayal. And so, they kept it private, passing fragments only to their children. The Americans fed us. They gave us butter. They treated us like people. In post-war Japan, butter itself took on a curious status. In markets and bakeries, it became a symbol of Western progress, imported luxury, and peace. Housewives who had survived on margarine now saved ration coupons for a single small pack. Magazines published recipes for butter cookies and sponge cakes, foreign creations that spoke of normal life. The smell of baking, once associated with enemy indulgence, now drifted through Tokyo's alleys as a promise of recovery. Yet for the women who had first tasted that richness behind barbed wire, the memory was never merely culinary, it was moral. They had seen decency appear where they least expected it, in a soldier's gesture, in a cook's quiet precision, in the discipline of care. Each time they spread butter on toast in the years that followed, they remembered that morning in the camp when everything they believed about enemies dissolved. It was not nostalgia, it was clarity. Some historians would later uncover their testimonies while compiling records of POW treatment under Allied supervision. They found consistency, the same astonishment, the same gratitude, the same quiet tears over food. A few accounts even described the camp officer, the teacher from America who made sure we ate well. Though his name had faded, what endured was the principle he embodied, that mercy after war carries greater power than punishment. Meanwhile, in the United States, the soldiers who had guarded those camps returned home, built families, and rarely spoke of their time overseas. To them, feeding prisoners had been routine, an unremarkable duty. Yet their small acts had written an invisible chapter of reconciliation. None of them could have imagined that decades later, the very women they served would teach their grandchildren English, study American nursing practices, and bake bread with real butter bought freely in post-war supermarkets. By the 1950s, Japan's relationship with America had transformed from occupation to alliance. Cultural exchange programs flourished, students studied abroad, American movies filled theaters, and butter, once condemned as foreign decadence, became a household staple. But its quiet symbolic weight remained. For those who remembered the camps, every ordinary breakfast carried an echo of that first forbidden kindness. As the decades passed, many of the former POWs faded. From public record, their diaries yellowed, their memories confined to family drawers. Yet even in silence, they contributed something lasting, a private truth that softened collective memory. Their stories proved that peace was not born in treaties or ceremonies, but in the smallest moments when people chose humanity over hatred. In 1975, during an interview for a Japanese television program marking 30 years since the war's end, one elderly nurse finally spoke. Her voice was steady, almost whispering. "When I tasted butter again," she said, "I understood that the war had truly ended." That simple sentence carried the weight of an era, a nation's awakening compressed into one sensory memory. The camera lingered on her face, lined with age but calm. For a brief second, the audience glimpsed what history books could never quite capture, the flavor of peace. In every war, history records the grand victories, the battles, the treaties, the flags raised in triumph. But history's quieter truth often lives elsewhere, in the fragile spaces between survival and compassion. For those Japanese women who once believed surrender meant death, peace arrived not with parades but with breakfast, a slice of bread, a spoon of butter melting under morning light. That taste became more than food. It was revelation. That mercy can emerge from discipline, that kindness can rebuild what bombs have broken. In that moment, the enemy ceased to be a shadow and became a person. The war for them truly ended not when guns fell silent, but when fear did. The butter they tasted was made from American milk, processed in factories thousands of miles away, packed by workers who would never know its destination. Yet somehow, through all the machinery of war, it carried humanity intact. It crossed oceans, survived heat and transport, and arrived precisely where it was needed. Not as propaganda, not as pity, but as proof that civilization had survived the madness. For years after, the memory remained. The faint smell of toast, the hum of generators, the warmth that spread through a body long denied comfort. They carried it home across the sea through ruins and hunger as the smallest symbol of redemption. In that act, women once taught to die rather than yield now weeping over butter, the world glimpsed what peace actually means. It is not loud, it is not heroic. It is a quiet decision to feed rather than destroy, to offer rather than avenge. History rarely honors the cooks, the guards, the nameless officers who made those choices. But their legacy endures in something far larger than glory, in the truth that the measure of victory is not how thoroughly one defeats an enemy, but how gently one treats them once defeated. And so, when the morning sun rose, over that small camp in 1945, glinting off the tin trays and the trembling hands that held them, it revealed not the aftermath of war, but the beginning of humanity's recovery.